October was a really good reading month. It was full of spine-chilling books and heartwarming stories and eye-opening nonfiction. So if you're in the market for some mystery or adventure or some thought-provoking insights, stay tuned because I'm going to go over my 6 favorite books I read this month. My name's Nick. This is Dr. Cranky Pants Reads. I'm so happy you're here. Let's roll up our sleeves and get started. So I'm taping this intro on October 27th, and when I pulled my stats from Storygraph this morning, I have read 15 books this month. That's a total of 4,214 pages. My average completion time was 6 days, and the majority of books that I read were between 300 and 499 pages. So I'm a little lower than what I would normally be, and I'm not surprised by that. I think, like a lot of people in the US, I have been really preoccupied with election activity. I have been writing postcards. I think I'm on like 300 at this point. I've been phone banking. I've been door knocking. I have been doing all of the things that I hope are going to allow me to wake up on November 6th, regardless of the result, and feel okay about the effort that I put into it. I don't want to leave anything on the field. And so my anxiety has really been channeled into those activities, which has taken some time away from reading, but it's still a fairly good number. Also, side note, if you're in the US and you're registered to vote, please do so November 5th. I'll see you at the polls. I'm working them. This is my, I think, 5th election that I'll be working at the polls, and it's always a delightful activity. If you are not yet registered to vote, some states still are within the window to get registered to vote. Check with your state if you can do same-day voter registration. So, all of that out of the way. I've got 6 books that I really enjoyed this month. I actually really enjoyed a lot of them, but I'm going to talk about 6 in particular. I'm going to start with middle grades and then move into informational, and then move into adult books. But I need to come up with a better title. I need to come up with a better category because that feels like, I don't know, the back room of a mid-90s video store, and like I should have a curtain. Welcome to the adult books, but the books for grown-ups, the ones that aren't, I guess, information, nonfiction can be for grown-ups too. I need to rethink that. That's what I'm getting down to. So, I'm going to noodle on that. If you have ideas, comment down below. And yeah, let's get moving with middle grades first. Novels this month that was so scary is how good they were. It was a little tricky to narrow it down to the 2 that I wanted to share, but I managed. So, first pick is Max in the House of Spies by Adam Gidwitz, who I really enjoy. He's written The Inquisitor's Tale and a couple of other books. This book was so good I've already passed it on, so I no longer have my physical copy, but it's this fantastical historical fiction novel that follows Max, who's moving from Berlin to London during World War II as part of the operation that moved young Jewish Germans out of the country into England, where he lives with his family, his English family. He is a super smart kid. He reminds me a little bit of Artemis Fowl. This whole book gives me some Artemis Fowl vibes because there are really some fantastical elements. Along the trip, as Max is leaving Germany, he picks up two hitchhikers, these two mythical creatures, Kobold and a Dybbuk, Berg and Stein, who add some extra dimension to Max's story. And once he gets to England, then things start really picking up because Max is a smart character, another thing that he has in common with Artemis, and works to both outsmart the English children around him who, let's be real, at that point in time, aren't that thrilled. So he's plotting a way to get back to Germany, Berlin specifically. And the ways in which he does it are really fascinating, really, really fun. It was a fast-paced book. It was also a really interesting novel in terms of talking about British colonialism and the histories of British colonialism. It felt like a really age-appropriate conversation about those elements, and it's part of a duology. And so I have particular criteria for any first book, and this book passed it with flying colors. Self-contained story, and there was a setup at the end. I felt really good about where that story ended, and I'm excited to pick up the new book, Max in the Land of Liars, coming out in February. So, delightful read. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it. And then we get to book number 2. I've seen this book a couple of different times. I've seen the normal version, and then McSweeney's has a really beautiful wooden version. It's Dave Eggers' The Eyes in the Impossible. This is an animal story. It follows Johannes, who is a dog living in a park on an island, and he is a free dog. There is no leash on him, and he runs. Eggers, in fact, does such a beautiful job of talking about Johannes and his running. They're in so many different ways. The language of this book alone is phenomenal. So, for instance, I've got Post-its because it was so good. I listened to this book. I highly recommend listening to it. Ethan Hawke narrates it, and the howling is reason enough alone. But in terms of the running, I took the earth under me and sent it into the past. I did again and again, taking the future and tossing it backward. And he does this consistently. Eggers does this consistently throughout the book, talking about how fast this dog is. It's such a perfect story of growing up and coming to terms with who you are and exploring the wider world. It's just a great book. Eggers develops characters really well, deals with some pretty heavy topics in, again, pretty appropriate ways. And just this language, I found myself writing down quotes all over the place. Like, okay, this one. Every reasonable creature knows that the worst thing they can do all day is think of themselves. If there are troubles on your mind, you should think first of the troubles of others. It's the essence of liberation. That is, freedom begins the moment we forget ourselves. Not very often that I get jealous of youth, but this is a case where I am jealous of youth. What would it be like to be a 5th grader reading those words? Can't even imagine. So, Dave Eggers, The Eyes in the Impossible. Highly recommend the audiobook. Again, Ethan Hawke. Oh, just so good. And then Max and the House of Spies, a really lovely, fantastical historical fiction novel. Really good middle grades reads this month. Scary good. My nonfiction for this month was very much done in preparation for an upcoming podcast episode. I co-host a podcast called Not That Kind of Doctor with my colleague Guy Trainin at the university. And we are focusing in on really supporting graduate students who are thinking about a job not within the academy. So I've been doing a lot of reading around that. And I think there's two books that I read that might be of interest to people. And connecting this to spooky reads, is there anything scarier than work? They're called Sunday Scaries for a reason. So the first book that I read that I thought might be interesting to other people is The School of Life's A Job to Love. The School of Life is a London-based organization who uses psychology and psychotherapy in order to help people live better versions of their current lives, whether that be healing, whether that be exploring things that they're interested in. They are an organization that seeks to support self development. And I like this book for how it approaches the topic of work from a large scale perspective, from a very philosophical perspective. They start with the premise of how did we start to think that our jobs had to be meaningful? How did we develop that thought process? And the notion that it came from a group of people for whom they really didn't have to earn money from their jobs, and so therefore their jobs could be meaningful because they didn't necessarily need to earn money from it, which is tricky, and how that thought has pervaded ever since. One of the really smart things that this book does is gives you exercises throughout to help you target what is most important to you. They could have felt hokey, but they didn't. They felt really connected and kind of integral to the work that any reader who would seek a book titled A Job to Love is looking to do. I found them particularly supportive of my thinking as I was going through. My favorite chapter was the chapter on settling. And the whole premise of that is no job is going to be perfect. How do you think through what's most important to you? And does your current job give you enough of those things in order to stay and be okay with it? Also, how do you begin thinking about, are you overworking yourself? Is it really your job? All of that was in here. It was a very nice introduction, more of a general conversation about trying to find work that, you know, allows you to feel good about yourself, but also doesn't support the whole live to work kind of mantra. So, the second book, and this is a little bit niche, is Leaving Academia, a Practical Guide. This is by Christopher Catherine, and he does a phenomenal job of helping people who have really specific skill sets. I have a very specific skill set. I know how to teach kids to read. I know how to teach them how to read well, and I know how to teach pre-service teachers how to teach kids to read well. But outside of that, how would I make that into a job? He does a really nice job thinking through, here's your specific, like, content based knowledge, right? And how do you then think about that in more generalized ways? And one of the things that he talks about in this book is how to really start acquiring new skills doing things. He's actually part of the reason why I started this YouTube channel, because of the opportunity to build up a new skill set that I wasn't getting anywhere else. I also really appreciated how, in I believe it's chapter 2, he begins to do the identity work of, look, academia is not a meritocracy. You can do everything right and still not find a job in academia. It's not your fault. It's not a reflection on who you are. It's a reflection on the fact that universities, because of budget constraints, oftentimes aren't opening as many positions as people graduating from PhD programs or EdD programs, even. And so there's a mismatch there. And so, what do you do? How do you undo all of that work
around, oh, but I'm an intellectual. Okay, so how do you learn to be something else? So I really appreciated how he handled that. There are some assignments within this. It's truly a practical guide in the same way that A Job to Love had reflective pieces throughout it. He does the same thing where he really wants people who are thinking about leaving academia to start understanding what kind of other jobs are possible, which I think is really helpful advice. I really appreciated the way that this book helped me think about expanding my own skill set and how might I talk about that with others outside of the academy. So, if you are thinking about a job change, whether you're in academia or not, A Job to Love and Leaving Academia, both really good choices. I'm really glad that I read them this month for my informational or nonfiction texts.
So let's dive into the two books that I've chosen to represent the grown-up fiction that I've read this month. And both happen to be fairly terrifying. The first book is The Angel of Indian Lake, which you saw in my BookTube newbie tag part 1. And I finished it, I listened to it, and I loved it. I have been a huge fan of that entire trilogy, and I love the fact that the book itself takes place on Halloween. The stakes are just raised so high, and you've got Prufrock on fire, you've got firefighters wielding chainsaws, you've got murders happening all over the place, and yet Stephen Graham Jones is wrapping up threads of this plot left and right. There's almost too much happening in the book. I felt at times like I needed an encyclopedia index to remember things. The cohesion across these 3 rather large tomes was impressive. I kept finding myself having to think back in terms of where did that happen? Oh, that's the reference. Oh. Again, I love a book with scope. So I love that all these things were connected, and I loved particularly the direction that Jade as a character took. She was this character who kind of as a misfit, and in this book she returns as a history teacher after spending time in prison and is this ultimate final girl who's leveraged all of her knowledge of horror movie tropes and put them to good use in this last volume. I was actually really sad to hear it end because I listened to this one because I don't know how many times characters like Jade come along, and I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the entire ride. I loved how Jones never held back and the ways in which he engaged us in horror and gore were always so creative and thoughtful. It was just a good ride. Book number 2 is probably one of my favorite books of the year. Oh, hold on. Hold. This one I do actually still have my paper copy of because I just finished it yesterday? Today? One of those two. Uh, Trees by Percival Everett. This was a finalist for the Booker Prize. It is 2 years old, 3 years old. And it's a book that I was intrigued by the premise. 3 years old, 2021. There's a murder. And the man who has been murdered is white, and he has been choked by barbed wire, and things are cut off. We'll leave that to your imagination. Things are cut off. And there's another body there alongside of him, but it's a dead body, like a body that has been dead for a while, of a black man who looks like Emmett Till. And when the coroner takes these bodies back to the mortuary, the body of the man who looks like Emmett Till disappears and reappears at a new murder. And then suddenly you have these kinds of murders happening all over the United States. And whatever it does here in these really short, dialogue-driven chapters is tells this story of the shame of lynching in America and retribution in a book that, like, it's a book about lynching, but I found myself laughing. Like, there are these cutting jokes between the two Mississippi Bureau of Investigation agents that are just hilarious, but it never loses focus on the larger social evil that it is interrogating and critiquing through this kind of horror trope. So The Trees is a book that really plays with genre. Is it a horror novel? There's definitely elements. Is it a crime novel? There's also definitely elements there. Are there magical elements? There's definitely possibilities. It was a book that kept me guessing. It was a book that I kind of tightness of The Trees was what I would have seen in in Reprieve from Matson, because it never lost its focus on the social story, the social critique. It was a hard book to read in terms of that. However, it was also a compulsive read, and definitely is one of my favorite books of the year, I think. I read it in maybe 4 days, and it's kind of a perfect book to end spooky season on. So, yeah. So like I said, October's been a really good reading month, and if any of these books has piqued your interest, or you have some recommendations for me based upon what you've seen here, put them in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. In November, we're going to dive straight into Nonfiction November. We're going to start next week with productivity books that actually helped me be more productive. I've read a lot of productivity books, and some of them aren't that good. They're just not that good. So I'm going to talk through 5 of them that actually impacted me getting stuff done. So look for that next Monday. There's also a bonus episode coming out tomorrow. I was tagged in the book murderer tag, and you won't want to miss it. It's entertaining, I think, maybe, possibly. But with that, thank you for watching. If you haven't already, like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate you. I hope life is good.